you, Selva, for the introduction. This presentation is about one aspect of long-form feature writing. It's really not about the techniques of writing so much as it is about the some ideas about how to organize your reporting and your writing. Trying to get my slideshow to work. There we go. This is a basic description of what use I hope the ideas that we discussed today will be to you. First of all, it gives you a simple framework with which you can plan a feature story, not only plan what you're going to go out and information you're going to gather, but also how to organize that information. So in a sense, it's like a checklist of things that you want to consider and things you want to be sure you look for as you gather information and start to put together your story. And also, in a sense, you can refer back to this framework as you finish to help you decide, when you really have everything you need, and is your story complete or not. One of the tricky things about long-form feature writing is that it's very easy to dive into a story and go in so many different directions that you kind of lose sight of where you stand and do you actually have the story, or do you still need to keep gathering information? So this is, in a sense, after you've gone through this framework and gathering your information and getting the idea conceptualized for the story, then after you've written it, this is one kind of final check you can use to see if you really have a complete story. I want to give acknowledgement to a mentor of mine, William Blundell, who was in my days at the Wall Street Journal, was one of the most successful feature writers, and he was so good at it that the newspaper editors actually made him take time out of I think almost every year to stop being a reporter and writer himself and to go teach others how to do it. And much of what I learned from him. And he actually did write down his ideas, some of which you'll see here, many of which are beyond the scope of this particular webinar. But you can, I strongly recommend this book to anybody who would like to learn more and think more about the as he calls it, the art and craft of feature writing. So for this webinar, we're going to really look at seven different dimensions of feature stories: theme, scope, impacts, reasons, history, counter moves, and futures. These are all pretty much Blundell's terms, and I want to spend our time together really talking about each of these elements in turn. So we'll start with theme, and you'll hear me talking a lot about theme because really I think it is, if you take any single idea away from this webinar, this is the one that I hope sticks with you. The theme simply is what is the point? What is the main message that you're trying to get across in your story? It seems pretty obvious to say that every story has to have a clear theme, and yet I have seen many stories and many feature writers falter because they haven't really carefully thought through this simple dimension of a story. Theme is really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very important to you. When you wade out into reality to write a story, there are so many different directions you can go. that it's very easy, and I know from personal experience because I've done this myself, to wade into a story and just get so intrigued by every issue that comes up during your reporting that you don't focus. And suddenly you find yourself several weeks down the road and a lot of work put in, and an editor who's very eager for you to produce something, and you realize you don't really have anything. You have lots of little strands and lots of little interesting ideas, but you don't have, a powerful and compelling story. So the way to avoid that hazard is to think early and often about what your theme is going to be. So the theme helps you concentrate and manage your own reporting, but it also is very important to the reader, because a reader, in a sense, when he picks up your story and starts reading it, he has no idea what went into it, what was behind it, what your motivation was. And he's going to decide very quickly whether or not he wants to spend time with you. And if you're writing a long-form story, he has to decide whether or not he wants to make a commitment of some time, some of his limited time, to hear what you have to say. So if you have a theme, it helps you tell the reader right away what to expect, where this story is going to go. It gives him a reason for why should he bother reading, and by the same token, tells him why he or why she should care enough to read about the story. So when you think about a theme, ask yourself, is it new, is it relevant, and is it important? Really, that if you can't say yes to those three questions, I think you're already in some trouble. And since the point of the theme is to really focus your reporting and your writing, you have to be very focused yourself. So ask yourself, can you summarize your theme in a single paragraph? When I was at the Wall Street Journal, there was a rule that every story had to have what we called a nut graph, a nut paragraph. And the nut paragraph was that one very simple paragraph, just 2 sentences, maybe 3 sentences, that really gave the essence of the story. If you can't really summarize your theme that simply, you need to think more about your theme, because you probably don't have a theme that's going to work for you as a guide in your reporting, and more importantly, you don't have a theme that is going to work for your readers when they follow it. And one thing I've learned from writing and also interacting with readers over the years is that readers very quickly lose interest if they don't have a very clear idea of what the story is about and what it's going to tell them. So ask yourself, can you summarize your theme in a single paragraph? Another good test is, could you write a headline for it? Somebody is going to write a headline for your story at some point, and the story and that headline is going to summarize the story and make it interesting enough and compelling enough for the readers to want to go ahead and read. So ask yourself, could you write a headline for your story? If you want to write a story, I used to have an editor, not Blundell, but one who also learned from Blundell and maybe taught Blundell too, who said that if you come and tell me you want to write a story and the story is about something, or you want to do an in-depth look at, name the issue, then you probably haven't really figured out your theme yet. The theme should make a definite point. So the theme is not about why the rate of vaccinations is going down. Or no, let me rephrase that. The theme, say you're a health reporter and you're writing a story about vaccinations. It's probably not going to be a successful story if you say you want to write about the history of vaccinations or what's going on in vaccinations today. You want a much more pointed theme. So a better story would be there's growing resistance to on the part of people to get vaccinated, and you're going to look at why that's happening and what's the impact. I hope you see the difference. And finally, one other good test of your theme is, have you gone out and tested it in the field? You have an idea about what the story is, but have you run that idea by some experts? Have you seen? Have you talked to maybe some actual people who will be your key sources in doing the story? And do they think that you're onto something? Do they think that this is a valid and good story? At the Wall Street Journal, it was a very, back then and still is a very big and successful paper with a good-sized staff. So everybody had a certain amount of time to really develop a story idea. And the fact is, you were really expected to have done a fair amount of reporting before you even proposed your story. And part of that reporting process is testing your idea to see if you really think it's going to pan out. Is it really a valid idea? That said, you can always find as you go along in your reporting that your theme will change. Maybe you go into it thinking the point is one thing, and you find something that's much more interesting, much newer, more relevant, and more important. So you need to be flexible enough to change your theme. But the important point for our discussion here is that you should think about your theme early and often. If you have to change it, that's fine, but you still want to have that focus so that you're disciplined in going out and actually getting the story. If you don't, you're going to waste a lot of time, collect a lot of information that isn't relevant, and worst of all, you may find out at the end that the information you have isn't entirely relevant to the point you want to end up making. So I've devoted a fair amount of time to talking about theme because it is really probably the single most important element in successful feature reporting and writing. And you'll hear me go back to that theme, the theme of the theme, several times as we continue. So theme is the first element. A second element to think about as you go out and start to develop your story is what Blundell called scope. Think of yourself as looking at the world through a pair of binoculars, or if you're looking at some very small part of the world, maybe even a microscope. What do you want to be sure to see in your the scope that you're using to look at the story? Scope really tells readers how widespread, intense, or varied the development that you're writing can be. And some stories have a very wide scope. Maybe you're trying to show how some general trend is affecting people in many different places in many different ways. So that's a really wide scope. Sometimes you have a very narrow, focused scope. Again, because I've spent a lot of my time reporting and mentoring people about health, I'll use another health example. Sometimes you might talk about a really widespread health problem. Sometimes you may talk about a problem that affects only a relatively small number of people, but it affects them very intensely. So you can have a very narrow scope. Also, of course, you have a development that may have all kinds of different ramifications. So that's another part of what the scope is. Finally, a final aspect of scope is I call it here perspective. It also could be what we call context. How does the particular issue you're writing about fit into some broader set of issues? When I was in India once, I talked to some people who had actually been involved in a story where somebody had been trampled and killed by an elephant. And the reporter it was just a news story that was just about that single issue. You know, that's a very intense story, an important story, something that people would definitely want to read about. But the editor thought, I wonder if there's more to it than that. And so she asked some questions, and she found out that conflicts between animals and people were actually on the increase as human population was spreading and actually spreading into areas where people hadn't lived before. And she was able to determine, first of all, that there was a growing number of incidents of elephants coming into conflict with people. But then she looked even farther and found out that it wasn't just about elephants, that there were all kinds of problems with tigers and other areas where, new human settlements near places that were tigers' habitats were leading to lots of very unfortunate incidents. So just by asking some questions and then going back to the reporter, she added a great deal of perspective to the story. And you can see how what was a narrow story became a much bigger and more interesting and more important story. So finally, you'll notice at the bottom of my slide, I say, what is your theme? It's very hard to get the scope right if you're not really focused on what is the basic point you're wanting to make. So ask yourself, as you're dealing with the issue of scope, keep asking yourself and reminding yourself what's the theme and how does the scope that you're defining and focusing in on, how does that relate to your theme? Impacts is another really obvious and very important part of any feature story. And let me just make an aside here that about all of these different story elements. When Bill Blundell, my mentor at the Wall Street Journal, was working on stories, he actually created separate file folders, and there was one for each one of these story elements. And as he came across, maybe he was interviewing somebody who was an expert who could really give him a lot of information about the context, but that person might have made a few comments about impact, which is what I'm about to talk about, and he filed that away in his impact file, so that when the time came to put all of these elements together into a story, he had a collection of material that went to each one of these different themes. So again, that was a very useful technique. As a way of organizing the information as you collect it. And I can't tell you how much easier it is to actually write your story if you have already thought about and organized your material into these different categories. So impact is fairly obvious. What is the effect of the issue that you're writing about? To go back to my example of vaccines, if you've decided that the story is that there's growing resistance on the part of people to getting vaccines, which incidentally is an issue in the U.S. and also in parts of Africa where I have worked. I don't know if that's an issue in India, but let's assume it is. You very obviously want to ask yourself, what's the effect? Who's helped by this? Who's hurt by it? And in what ways are they hurt or helped? Sometimes you find out that the impact goes to the very heart of the story. Somebody is proposing some kind of change in policy. Very often, obviously you need to know, why are they proposing it? How is that going to affect them? A lot of times it's their own self-interest. Again, in health journalism, many times, companies are out dramatizing the importance of some new drug or some new treatment, but they also have a very important self-interest. That doesn't mean that what they're advocating is not valid, but as journalists we need to be skeptical, and we need to look at their motives and see if their motives really are pure, if the claims they're making for their new treatment really are valid, or are they really just trying to promote their own business. And finally, I want to remind you that there are really tangible impacts, but there are a lot of emotional impacts that a development, news story, a development, an issue that you're focusing on may have. And that's a very important ingredient in the story. What's the emotional impact of the story that you're working on? Again, just a little reminder, what is your theme? It's very easy to get lost when you're looking for impacts and find all kinds of effects and things that are going on out there that may not be relevant to your theme. And you're going to have a much harder time having a successful story if you don't remember that you're looking for impacts that relate to the theme that you've defined. So impacts is the second ingredient. Reasons is a third, and again, this is Blundell's term. It's kind of the why and the who, what, when, where, why, and how. You need to explain to people why the issue that you're writing about is an issue. If there's resistance to vaccines, why is that? Here are some kinds of reasons. Very often, the reasons are economic. I spent my many years as an economic journalist, and the reason I was drawn to writing about economics was that I often found that economics was the most powerful explainer for much of what goes on in this world. Certainly not everything, but for many things. It almost never fails. Any story you're looking at, if you ask yourself what are the economic drivers. In the story about animal conflicts with human beings, the reporters found that there were very clear economic reasons that people, very often poor people, were settling in areas where that hadn't been settled before because economic realities forced them to do that. So in a sense, the story about the conflict between elephants and other animals and human populations really became, in part, a story about the economic hardships that some members of society faced. But economic reasons that's just one kind of reason. There are also social reasons. Maybe there are changes in culture, customs, moral, family values or dynamics that also can be affecting, that can explain the story you're doing. Obviously, as journalists, we spend a lot of our time looking at political and legal issues. All too often, we really talk about the lawmakers and the politicians without really looking at the impacts, the reasons for the laws they're proposing, the changes in regulations, the tax policies they're adopting. And sometimes we need to look at those changes in laws as not as the beginning of the story or as the end of the story, but really as the beginning, the reason that lies behind other changes that are going on in society. And let's face it, sometimes there are psychological reasons that explain something. Sometimes, especially in politics, there really aren't many reasons that go beyond, or at least a major reason for why political actors do what they do. The reasons can be their own ego issues, their conflict they've had with other people in the past. Um, so you obviously have to be attuned to those and look for those. Sometimes they may turn out to be relatively minor. Sometimes they are the primary reasons. Um, and finally, sometimes it's hard to find reasons for what goes on other than history. I think this is probably true in many stories that people do in India, where there are, very often religious and ethnic conflicts. And sometimes when you ask yourself, why is it that Group A seems to have a conflict with Group B, it's hard to really find the reasons other than it's been that way for a long time, and there were grievances that people have about the past. So sometimes, again, when you're talking about the reasons, it's hard to ignore, and sometimes it's hard to go beyond the fact that these conflicts are deeply rooted in history. One interesting thing is when you focus on history is if there isn't much of a reason except history, one group is in conflict with another because it's been that way for a long time, that actually can diffuse conflicts because it forces people to say, this is a conflict that's gone on for a long time, so long that we can't even remember the reasons for it. Maybe that's a suggestion that we need to take another look at what's going on and ask ourselves, is there any reason for this conflict to continue? Again, it's hard to answer that question unless you are focused on your theme. So once again, I'm going to beat my drum and remind you, when you look for the reasons, be sure you're looking for reasons that go directly to what is the theme of your story. Trying to advance the slide. There we go. I actually, at one point, treated history, and I still do treat history sometimes as an independent part of the story, although as I just mentioned, it is a special category of reasons. But I think it's worth maybe just a brief separate mention, because I think that all too often journalists, being news people and focused on news and what's new, don't pay enough attention to history. And I think actually if you tell stories well, if you talk about history well, a lot of people are very interested in history. So I just would like to make a special plug for remembering history. Sometimes, as I say here, history is the reason for the events you're writing about. But even if it's not the primary reason, it also can help us understand why an issue is important. And sometimes you look at history just because it offers clues about what might happen next. If you're writing about an issue that's been an issue for a long time, it can be a very important part of your story to say, this issue came up 10 years ago, and here's what happened then. Or 50 years ago, and here's what happened then. There's a famous quote by the philosopher and writer George Santana: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Part of our job as journalists is, I had an editor who said we're writing the first draft of history, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. But one of the reasons why we're doing that is because we want to learn from the past, so that history, especially when it's an unhappy history, does not repeat itself. So that's my special pitch for writing about history. I know journalists who actually have made a specialty of that, and very often, if they're good writers, their stories are among the best read stories that get written day to day. Counter moves is Blundell's term for kind of what happens in response to the issue you're writing about. For every action there is a reaction, the physicists tell us, and I think that as journalists we certainly know about that. So one of the things when you're writing about an issue, if you're writing about a problem in particular, which is what we often do write about, the obvious question is, all right, well, what is being done about this? That kind of opens a whole new avenue for your coverage. If you're writing about a problem, say population stresses in a particular community, new communities being built, that can be the counter move. If your story is about, rapid, dramatic population growth, the counter move can be the emergence of new cities. When I was in India the last time, which was just earlier this year, I actually talked with journalists about a whole story about new cities, which were actually being very consciously developed as a response in part to population pressures. But and when you write about counter moves, in a sense, you get into a whole subsection where you have to look at some of the dimensions that we've already been talking about of feature writing all over again. If there's a counter move, what is the impact? Very often we find that policies are developed in response to a problem that have unintended consequences. Maybe the policymakers didn't think through all the impacts of what they were writing about, or what they were designing policies to address. So, a key part of our job as journalists is to examine these counter moves, to look at the unintended consequences, to ask ourselves and our readers, are they working? It's very hard for me to imagine any feature story that doesn't address the issue of counter moves. Very often the counter move becomes the key to the whole story. In politics and public life, really when you think about it, there aren't all that many issues that are new. There are issues, I think it's much more common for issues to arise again and again and again. And as you know, editors don't like stories that just go over the same thing over and over and over again. So a lot of times what's really new and interesting is not the issue itself, which may be fairly familiar to people, but what is the new policy that's being adopted? What is the new response? Sometimes counter moves are not deliberate. I've been talking about policies that are designed to, in response to particular problems. But a lot of times, the counter move happens without any conscious, deliberate planning by policymakers. I'm sure that in communities where there is a lot of conflict between animals and humans, that the people who live there on the ground are doing things about it in response to it. Maybe they're relocating, maybe they're building, barriers, maybe families are not letting their children wander far from home. All of these impacts are very fertile ground for stories. One of the other things that Blundell taught me is that when you're first looking for a story, it's very useful to think about what goes on in your community or the area you're covering in terms of cause and effect. Very often you might have a story. One of the examples he used was a shortage of doctors. Some areas have a shortage of doctors. And, that may be an old issue. In Africa, where I worked for a long time, that's a perennial issue. Everybody knows about that. In many parts of Africa, there's a severe shortage, not just of doctors, but of all kinds of medical experts. So in a sense, the story isn't so much there's a shortage of doctors, because we all know that, but maybe the story is on what are the counter moves, how is society responding to this phenomenon. In Africa, one of the common responses is a great reliance on home remedies, on traditional healing, which in some cases is very helpful and valid, but also there are all kinds of quacks out there who take advantage of people's desperation for treatment, for care, for their problems, to sell them remedies that aren't remedies at all. So that is another form of counter move. And again, as I say, that probably ought to be a story, an element in almost any story you do. And in some stories, it may be the single most important element in the story that you're writing. Whether it's a relatively minor part of your story or whether it is the essence of your story depends on, here's the reminder again, what is your theme? This is something that you have to keep focused on so that you know where exactly the counter moves, like all the other elements of the story that we're talking about, fit into your overall story. It's very strange for me to be talking to people who I know are out there, and including at least one friend I know who is out there, and not being, I can't look at your faces, I can't see if you're smiling or if you're looking out the window, and maybe even opening your paper bag to have a snack. I hope that this is all working for you. I know I'm going through quite a bit very fast, and it's a bit abstract, but I hope this is relevant to you. And when we get to questions, which we will soon, I hope that you can give me some feedback and tell me where I lost you, or where I didn't make any sense, or what you think I overlooked. But first, let me talk about really the last of the major elements of any feature story, and that is what my mentor and trainer called futures. It's really very difficult for me to imagine a story, any story, that doesn't in some way or other talk about the future, what's going to happen next. Really, when you think about it, a lot of people follow the news, read feature stories, because they're trying to know what's in store, what's going to happen in their lives next. How are the developments that they see swirling around them right now going to affect them tomorrow? What do they need to do to be ready? What do they need to do in the future to be ready to deal and respond appropriately to the situation that you're describing? So these are questions that you should ask yourself and your sources about, and you should plan to address in some way or other in the story that you write. What may happen next? If things, sometimes it's very tricky to write about futures because it's speculative and nobody knows the future. And journalists really are very reluctant to wade into this area because it is tricky and it's very easy to be wrong. It's very easy to make a prediction and be disproven sometimes almost before the ink is dry on the paper. And one way to protect yourself about against all the pitfalls is to pose a question that's a very legitimate question, and that is, if the situation that you're describing doesn't change, what are going to be the consequences? Back to the story that I suggested about vaccinations. If people really do increase in increasing numbers start to not get their children vaccinated, not get vaccinated themselves, what are the possible consequences? In the U.S., health professionals used to brag that we completely defeated the disease of measles. Well, guess what? Measles is starting to make a comeback. And it's starting to make a comeback in part because people got so complacent and in some cases, had fears about vaccinations that they stopped getting vaccinations. It is a legitimate question for you to ask your sources and then to say in your story that if this situation doesn't change, here are the possible consequences. You can look for formal studies or projections to get to this issue, but you also can just ask your experts, your observers. If this situation continues the way it's going, what do you fear might happen? That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. You can put in all the necessary caveats to acknowledge that nobody knows the future, but if current trends continue, here are some of the consequences that we should be looking for. Back to Blundell's point about thinking about causes and effects, ask yourself, okay, I'm describing the situation today. What are the possible effects of this situation in the future? And then you can speculate carefully about that in your story, but that also is a clue to you about what to look for in your next story. At what point does the possible effect become an actual effect and become the theme for a good story that says something new and important and relevant about an old issue? Again, futures is tricky, so don't go out too far out on a limb when you talk about futures in your story. One way to keep yourself in safer ground is to remember at all times what is your theme. You're not giving people an open-ended picture of the future. You're talking about a specific issue that you have defined very carefully, and then giving some clues about the future as it relates to that theme that you have defined so carefully and so well at the beginning and all through your reporting process. So that really gets us to the summary of all of the major ingredients to a feature story that I wanted to talk with you about today. This is not a webinar that's really going to talk about the craft of writing. I do recommend Blundell's book because he does write. He was a beautiful writer, and he does talk a lot about some of the more specific writing techniques. But I did want to talk about maybe a first step in writing, in taking all of these separate ingredients and putting them together, and that's just maybe give you a rough scheme for how all these elements might fit together. So this diagram shows one possible, very general outline to a story. And it shows how these different elements might be fit together. Every story has to have some sort of an introduction. Again, it's talking about how to write introductions is the subject for another webinar. But very typically, certainly in the Wall Street Journal, but really in almost any good news story or feature story that you read, there will be an introduction that grabs you very quickly, pulls you in, makes you want to read the rest of the story, and very quickly states the theme. The theme, again, in writing, when you write the theme, it's what we at the Wall Street Journal used to call the nut graph. And the nut graph has actually become such a standard concept that it's no longer an exclusive possession of the Wall Street Journal. It's taught in journalism schools all over the U.S. In the Wall Street Journal, the rule of thumb was that you really should be able to find the nut graph in a story within the first 3 to 5 paragraphs of the story. That's kind of like it's the statement of what this whole story is about and what it's going to deliver. So in a story, say you've gathered all these materials, you've now figured out what your introduction is and what your theme, and you've written that nut graph for your theme. Now your story is set up, and so now you can start lining up the different elements. In this particular scheme that I've given you, and this is just one of many possibilities, I say that the third element could be the scope. So I've given the introduction to get you interested. I've stated here's the theme. The next thing I'm going to say in this particular scheme is, and here's where this issue can be found. Here's how it's playing out. A very common opening paragraph for a section on scope in the Wall Street Journal would say, if the story started out with an anecdote, one particular community or one particular issue had this experience, the scope is what broadens it and says, this is happening not just for this person I've introduced in the introduction. This is not happening just for the community that I'm describing or the organization I'm describing, but it's happening all over the country. And then I'm going to give you some facts that show that it's happening all over the country. Resistance to vaccines is not just a problem in this one community, but it's popped up in these different places all over. So the scope is really, one purpose of the scope is to show that this is relevant. This is important. This isn't a story just about one person, one family, one community, but it really affects all of us. So in this scheme, I give the scope next. And then I could say, and here's why it's happening. So reasons, which again, you notice that there are arrows between all of these different elements. You can actually, a big part of writing is connecting these different elements. So, if I've started with the introduction and I've said, such and such a community had this experience, here is the experience that we're really writing about, that's the theme. Then I say, it's happening all over. That really shows you how broad it is. Here are the reasons it's happening. Notice there's been an it that's been connecting all of these things. The it is the theme. And you can open each one of these separate sections. You can open your reasons section by, physically, in words, reminding me of the theme by saying, this theme, the resistance to vaccinations, is happening because. So in a sense, you can see I've restated the theme, and now I'm giving the reasons for it. In this scheme, again, my next step would be then to give the impacts. I've now told you what the theme is, how widespread it is, why it's happening. Here are the effects that it's happening. Here are the effects of what is happening. So again, you can see there's a very logical flow from the introduction to the theme, to the scope, to the reasons, to now the impacts. So now a very obvious step would be, and here's what's being done about it. That's the counter move. Again, notice that I said it. Here's what's being done, not just about in general, something in general, but here's what's being done about this particular issue that is the theme of this story. This is why I put theme in the middle. Theme should arise in every one of these different sections. Theme is really the glue that holds the whole story together. So now when I talk about here's what's being done about this particular problem, you know, say it's the shortage of qualified health professionals. You know, here's what the government's doing. Here are what communities are doing on their own. Here's what some individuals, what people are doing themselves. You can list all of those various counter moves. You can explore, are the counter moves likely to work? Are they not likely to work? Are they having unintended consequences? At some point when you've exhausted the issue of counter moves, you move on to the futures. So what's going to happen next? You know, again, as I said, this is a little more tricky because you're moving into the realm of speculation. As I said, you know, one of the safest ways to talk about the future is just to say, you know, if these current trends continue, here are likely to be the consequences. But you know, there are other things you can also talk about. You can say that this growing problem that you're writing about is almost certain to be an issue in the next political campaign. Or maybe this is an issue that the Parliament is certain to be taking up. And you know, here are how the political forces might align behind, you know, legislation that's being proposed. So futures is a very obvious place and a very common place to end the story. And then but you do have to write an ending yourself. And again, as I say, that's one thing that I maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want, but I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular webinar. Let me just say quickly one thing, or underscore something I've already said about this particular scheme. I've given you one very logical flow for a story, but it's not the only one. You may decide that your main point, the theme of your story, really is a reason. You know, maybe there's some phenomenon that everybody is very familiar with and they know is happening. There's an increase in crime, for instance, perhaps. So your real theme, the real point you're going to make is, why is this happening? So you may have reasons much farther up. You may move reasons, you know, you may encapsulate reasons in your theme, and scope may be something that you deal with fairly quickly because it's not that important. These boxes don't have to all be equal in size. You know, by the same token, you may have an issue that's an old issue. Everybody knows about it, but the real issue is what's going to be done about it. So your counter moves may not be down here toward the end of your story, but it may be right up here, right near the top. You know, Parliament, when it convenes for its new session, is going to have a whole slew of bills dealing with the crime wave. So you're really talking, in a sense, about counter moves right at the outset. And then you're going to have to go back and you're going to say, you know, the crime wave, here's how big the crime wave really is, and here's why people think it's going to happen. But then you go back to, and here are the effects that it's happening. But then the bulk of your story, the real heart of your story, is what's being done about it, and the futures. Are these proposals to do something about it likely to work? So I want to emphasize that, only you can define the theme, and when you define the theme, it's going to drive the actual logical sequence that you want to follow as you lay out these different elements. But you probably, no matter what you decide your theme is and whether you're focusing on the future, sometimes there are stories that focus entirely on the future. Are people optimistic about the future? That's a very common story you see, at least in the U.S., in political stories. And very often the candidate who gives the most reasons for optimism is the one who wins. So right now in the U.S. there's a very negative tone to a lot of our politics. I think you could very easily do a story that say that people are afraid about the future. They're worried about the future. So futures actually becomes the theme of your story. I just say this again to underscore that this is one scheme. It kind of gets you thinking about a scheme, which is the important thing. You need to, to have a scheme in mind related to the theme, which you have thought about very carefully. But the actual scheme is one that you will define when, when it comes time to put the story together. Although, just as I said, you should be thinking about theme from the beginning. The theme, in a sense, you begin with a hypothesis, and you test that hypothesis, and pretty soon it becomes more and more, a theme that you're certain about. The point is you think about it early and throughout the whole process. It doesn't hurt to also think about these other elements as they relate to the theme and how you ultimately will want to put them together. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't go too fast or talk so much in the abstract that that it wasn't useful to you. But now is your chance to tell me if it wasn't useful, and maybe we can have a conversation about these issues. So, Selva, I hope you're still there.
Yeah, Chris, I'm there, and that was a really good presentation. And we have a few questions from the participants. So first is I want to ask how to write a good nut graph. It's a participant who asked this question. So I just want you to share it to the participant. How to write a good nut graph?
Well, that's a great question, and I actually, if I don't want to bore you by having you watch me search my files and come up with a slide or two about that. So let me just instead just talk off the top of my head. I think that in a sense you write a good nut graph the way you do any good writing. You try to write simply. Don't get too complex. In straightforward and fairly, blunt sentences. And really sometimes, I think if there's one rule to good writing that any writer should follow, it's make it short. Look at any sentence you've written and see if there's some way you could say the same thing in fewer words. And again, focus. If you are really focused on your nut graph, on your theme, if you really have gone through that exercise that I said about seeing if you can write it in just a few sentences, seeing if you can imagine the headline, um, um, kind of write that sentence and then see if you can make it shorter, and as direct and to the point as you can. But you also want to make it provocative. Um, so think about what you can say that's going to stir a bit of a reaction from your reader. While it is important to write a nut graph, often nut graphs are supported by good quotes. I used to have it's almost a formula, and in fact, I think if you were to look through all the stories that I've written, you would probably find the majority of them follow this principle. Start with an anecdote that may be just 2, possibly 3 paragraphs, then the one nut graph, and then a quote. And the quote kind of wraps it up neatly in a sense, the whole introductory section is a nice unit. Somehow there's something about the quote that that rounds it off very well. So again, a really standard nut graph might say, say you started out with an anecdote about the little boy who was trampled by the elephant. Your nut graph then might say, unfortunately, this boy is not alone. All over India today, there are a growing number of incidents with tragic consequences like his. And then you might you might add a sentence that just amplifies that a little bit, from such and such a place in the south to such and such a place in the north. Law enforcement officials reported a growing trend of human-animal conflict. There's your nut graph. Okay. in maybe 3 sentences.
Okay.
Whoops, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, we have a couple of more quick questions. But actually, we're just running out of time, so maybe I would request
I'm sorry.
We could quickly answer to the question so that we can take more questions. So the next question is from a person, once again, from Mr. Sriram Satyamurthy, and he asked, what is the maximum size of a good long-form article?
Well, that really depends a lot on your particular publication. At the Wall Street Journal, which did have long-form features, I think sometimes a story could be as long as 3,000 words. Sometimes they could be half that length. I think that it's as writers, we all have the tendency to believe that everything that we know is vitally important and incredibly interesting to people. But the fact is, it's probably more important to us than anybody else. So, if you err, it's probably better to err on the side of being short. You can write a very powerful story in 500 words, or even less than that if you need to. And one point I like to make with people is, you remember, especially in the newspaper business, we publish every day. There's no shortage of paper or ink. So if you have so much to say and it is so good that you can't possibly tell it in the space that your editor is giving you, think about how you can carve it up into a series or just a number of different periodic stories. You could actually imagine a feature story where each story in the feature is one of the elements that we've talked about. One story, you could devote a whole story to the reasons, one story to the impacts, one story to the counter moves. If the issue is important enough and compelling enough, you can get by with that. I think that, and finally, let me just say, it all depends. I guess this is what I already said. It all depends on your readers and your editors and your publication. I think you can adapt a long-form feature to whatever the requirements are of your paper and your editor.
Okay, Chris. I think there are a lot of questions coming up now. So maybe I'll just take two more questions because we're really behind time. And the next question is, see now a question from Mr. Sajan Kumar. He asks, like, do we need to adapt new techniques to hook our readers while writing in digital media? Or is it the same old print technique which need to be adapted? Is there something different we need to do for long form articles, reading via tablet or mobile or desktop?
I think I know this questioner.
Yes.
So hello. I think that's a very interesting question, and I actually think that yes, we do have to develop some new techniques, and in particular, this is the age of the internet. And if you look at writing on the internet, and I know that Sunil, who is also with us, unless I've driven him away, is an expert on this. But one characteristic of writing on the web is that it's direct and it gets to the point, and the writer tends to relate a lot personally to the reader. And I think that those are all valuable techniques, and I think that kind of writing increasingly is what people expect. And even though we're talking about long-form feature stories, I think that we could learn a lot from looking at web writing and have that same immediacy, get right to the point, and don't think that long form means that you have an unlimited number of words and can write and write and write to your heart's content. The fact is everybody's busy, and people are increasingly impatient with stories that don't get right to the point, tell people what they need to know directly. So I actually think that good long form stories could be written in the style of good web stories. Let me just also add, it's a common perception, but it's not accurate, that web stories are shorter than newspaper stories. You actually find some very, very long stories on the internet. They're long because the content is good. They're long because that's what the story demands. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, Chris. And the next one is like from Saptarishi Bhattacharya, and he asked, how do you overcome lack of information or data to support your story when there's like, so now we do have digital media and other things to gather resources or data, but there will be a point we don't have information or data to support your story. How do you overcome that?
So how do you deal with the situation where you don't have enough information?
Yes, perfect. That's the question.
Well, that's an interesting question. My first answer is make sure you've done everything you can to find that information, to find what information there is. So the burden is on you to get information. People are reading you because you're the expert and the professional and the person who has the time to find the information that they don't have. But if you are in a situation where the real fact of the matter is that we just don't know the answers to important questions, I would consider writing a story about what we don't know. Maybe you can say, the fact of the matter is that the government does not collect adequate information to guide it in developing a policy to deal with this problem. And that actually could be a pretty interesting story. Why don't we know, what we need to know? What exactly do we need to know? What are the impacts of our ignorance? You can see I'm kind of fitting that theme into a scheme for a whole story. I actually, when I'm reporting, I always think that one of the best questions to ask an expert is, what don't you know? And if there's one thing you wish you knew, what would it be? And very often that leads you down very useful reporting paths. So if you're sure you've done due diligence, job of reporting, and you're sure your story is important and you just don't have the facts, one solution might be to write a story about the fact that we don't know the facts and explore that.
Okay, so thank you, Chris.
I could get very interested about that story, in a story like that.
Yeah, so we have just one final question which you can take, and it's from Manoj Ramesh, and he asked, what makes the difference between a good and a bad story? A huge amount of information, anecdotes, survey reports, or just good vocabulary? What's the difference between a good and a bad story?
That's a very interesting question. Some people think that the key is just to have a ton of information. And I would say that, information is good, and you want to make sure you have plenty of information. But to me, I read a lot of stories by very hardworking and diligent people that just overwhelm me with too much information and don't really do the necessary job of sifting through the information to tell me just what I need to know and why I need to know it. I had an editor once who told me that a big part of our job as journalists is to determine what people do not need to know, as well as what they need to know. So to me, the good story is the one that has information that is very relevant, very compelling, and supports a strong theme. The fact of the matter is, if I read a newspaper story in the morning, by the afternoon or evening, I'm not going to remember all that much about it. What I may remember are some really colorful anecdotes in it. And I also, what we hope is I come away with a general idea about, what's going on and why it's important. To me, the real test is what do I remember about the story the next day? And if the story is successful, if it's a good story, I'm going to remember the theme. I'm going to carry with me that basic point, and maybe just a few facts and a few items, few details that really amplify that fact. So, good story is a strong theme and information well organized that support that theme.
Okay, so thank you. So we have a few more questions, but I'll request Chris to maybe email the response by sharing it with him. And so thank you, Chris, and thank you all the participants, because at the end we had a huge amount of questions popping up into my chat box. So I'm really sorry. Yeah.
I'm sorry we ran out of time so quickly. Time flies when you're having fun. But I didn't put my email address on the slide. But if you can forward those questions to me, I would be I'd be honored to to answer them to the best of my ability.
Yeah, sure, Chris. I'll just forward you the question. And so really sorry, because of time constraints we couldn't take more questions, and I hope the webinar was interesting and helpful, and hope we'll have future webinars which will be communicated to you. And thank you for joining us. So we'll have this presentation to all the participants, and also the YouTube video link to all the participants. We'll share it maybe tomorrow or day after. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Chris. So hope you had a good time.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time, and please send questions and feedback.
Yes, will do, Chris. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot for
Okay.
joining us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good. Thank you.